We have all lived through adversity, but can we thrive through adversity as a leader? Our guest today says, yes, you can. Welcome to episode 137 of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, welcome everybody. It is the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. My guest today is Dr. James Kelley. Let me tell you about Dr. James Kelley. He's the author of this brand new book. If you happen to be watching, you can see it. I've got it. He's got 2 copies behind him. He is the author of The Crucible's Gift, 5 Lessons from Authentic Leaders Who Thrive in Adversity. He brings a fresh perspective to leadership coaching and keynotes. His journey from a humble home in Portland, Oregon, through Dayton, Ohio, to living near Dubai with his wife and 4 children is full of adversity. James also has a keen interest in the adversity that shapes great leaders around the world. Whether as the host of his On Hiatus After Hours podcast or giving a keynote speech at a conference. See, I told you, man. James loves to dive deep and share stories of how and why leaders need crucible moments to be a better version of themselves. He believes that his unique journey, filled with ups and downs, twists and turns, and driving curiosity, equips him to bring great value to the world of executive leadership. And I'm excited to have you as my guest today. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me on the show. I'm so greatly appreciative of it.
We had a short chance to get to know each other before we get started, and I was excited to have him. His book has been out a while, and of course, in the world of podcasting, who knows when you're actually watching or listening. But even as this first gets released in December, the book's been out for a while, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we get to the book itself, as I introduced you, James, your bio points to the fact that you have an interesting journey. You sort of point at the fact that you have an interesting journey. Portland, Dayton, Dubai, and who knows what else in between. So tell us just a little bit about your path to get you to where you are today.
Sure. So it's funny. I listened to one of your podcasts earlier today, and I cannot remember her name, but she had someone who lived in Ireland and lives in California now, but lived in the Midwest for like 7 or 8 years.
Yes.
And I'm blanking out on her name.
I am too.
Edit.
My producer will not be happy with me, James.
So my point is that similar to her, I've lived in 3 different countries, all as an adult, and I've been very lucky to embrace the idea of living abroad, because I think that it takes sometimes a unique perspective to want to do it and to love it. So I grew up in, like I said, Portland, Oregon. I joke and I say it was an Irish Catholic household with a touch of violence, minus all of the Catholicism, but with a butt ton of guilt. So we had the grand house in that perspective. And so, from that, I was not expected to do much at all. In fact, I had teachers say he wasn't as bad as I thought he was going to be. My parents who said, try college, not go to college. So the expectations weren't high for me. So I overshot. So yay me at this point. And so, yeah. And so from there, I struggled a bit through undergrad. I didn't really understand how to learn. But what I did understand is I had a propensity of curiosity about certain topics. And so I think that was kind of my linchpin. And so I ended up eventually at the age of 30, moving to Australia and getting my PhD at the University of Western Australia. But just prior to that, I lived in Japan for a year teaching English, which is just a fascinating experience in and of itself. But after I got my PhD, I moved to Philadelphia, and I was in Philly for 7 years at St. Joseph's University. And man, I'm really giving you the abridged version of this, by the way. And then from there, I hit a massive failure, and I moved to Dubai through a nudge, or just outside Dubai, through a nudge, and to teach at a university now, which has been a blessing because it's paid for my book. It's paid for some other innovations and entrepreneurial activities that I've got going on. And so I've been pretty lucky from that perspective to get the funds to do it.
So the book is about the crucibles, the adversities that we live through, and the title sort of tells us that. But tell us a little bit about obviously you've got your own, but tell us a little bit about the premise. And I know there's a backstory to the book.
Yeah. So the book is predicated on the podcast that I'm on hiatus from, called the Executives After Hours. And, in that, similar to you, at the time, all up, I interviewed 200 people, but for the book, it was 140 executives. And the tagline of the show was, I care about who you are, not what you do, because who you are defines what you do. And so I almost never asked the executives and CEOs about their job, because I honestly just didn't care. What I cared about was, from their childhood to adulthood, how they got to where they were at. And there's so many interesting bits of information. I mean, here's a great example. Some of the leaders I interviewed, majority of them that were uber successful, we can define that differently, but at large companies, at least turning six-figure revenues and things like that, all started working between the ages of 10 and 13. About 50% of them had a paper route. So there's some really interesting facts in that. Paper route teaches you hard work, commitment, collection, sales. Early morning. Yeah. So there was a lot of really interesting findings from those. But what I found most fascinating was the level of consistency of leaders who went through some sort of major adversity, and that helped define them to be better leaders in themselves. And they would tell you that their ego got in the way, or they weren't self-aware, any number of factors. But at the end of the day, what ended up happening is that some major event caused a fundamental shift in who they are and the outputs they were trying to create through their leadership activities.
So you took those insights. I mean, you talk about that in the forward of the book. You sort of took those insights and said, hey, there's something more here. I'm starting to learn something new as I synthesize all of that. Is that a fair way to say that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think with the background that I have, which is it's not any more unique than anyone else who has a PhD or doesn't have a PhD, but I took a what's called grounded theory approach, which is took all the podcasts, transcribed them all. And then within that, you just start seeing these themes again and again as I read them. So the grounded theory approach is basically look for themes that pop up and use those themes as kind of the framework of your findings. And that's, I'm not a qualitative guy, I'm a quant guy. So I do stats, but this to me was an interesting way to do the research, because there was excerpts that you could pull from the podcast that provided the evidence that you needed, which is in the book. Right. And it provides support. So yeah, it was a really interesting way to do it. And I think the most interesting way, honestly, is how I wrote it, because I wrote the book in 7 weeks. And so I wrote it in Portugal while my wife and kids were on the beach, and I was in a coffee shop every day. And I had a really interesting theme, because I knew where I wanted to go with the book. I think that when you write a book, and I know that you've written a book, when you write a book and you know where you want to go with it, it can be quite easy to get there if you have a system in place. And so what I would do is on Mondays, I would research that week's topic, academic literature, read some books, and I'd read the books. I would get books where I'd get it in audio, and then I'd get the digital version, and I'd put it on double speed, and I'd listen to it and watch the words highlight, and then highlight what I needed. So I'd read a book in like 4 hours, essentially, even less depending on the book. But that was Monday. Tuesday was the outline that I'd put in question format. Wednesday, my wife would interview me because she didn't know the topic. She would ask clarifying questions. What do you mean by that? Can you expand this idea? Wednesday afternoon, I'd get it transcribed. Thursday, I'd have it in my inbox. Thursday and Friday, I would wordsmith it, and I'd be a chapter. And then I did that again and again and again. And so within 7 weeks, I had a whole book, and then it was off to the editors, and that whole, as you know, rigmarole 25 times back and forth.
There you go. There you go, everybody. Yeah. So you got a lesson in how to write a book. Now, here's where we are in agreement. People that say, well, it took me 7 years to write the book. I'm like, why? Like, you just got to start writing. Let's get on with this. Let's move on. Start it and move on. And, I've done it several times and doing it several more. And there's no reason to not just get started. How do you write a book? You start writing. But
for you, it's probably easy to get started. Like, I had a hard time starting. Like for me, the first page, I might as well get my fingernails plucked out one at a time. Like today I'm writing a workbook for this book to come out by the end of the year. And it took me 2 hours to write 2 paragraphs because I kept going back and forth on ideas. Now, if I just audio did it, I'd be done today. Right?
Hey, let me give you a tip, James. Just audio do it. It'll be done.
I know.
You already told us how you did it.
I know.
Follow your own advice, brother.
All right, I'll stop.
Well, that gets at one of the 5 lessons. One of my favorites, actually. There are 5 lessons in the book. So let's start there. The subtitle of the book is 5 Lessons from Authentic Leaders Who Thrive in Adversity. We're all going to face adversity. So my question is this: what are the 5? Real quick. Let's just go through the 5 real quick.
Yeah. So essentially, it is self-awareness, compassion, integrity, relatableness, which is a made-up word, but that's all right. I own it. And then growth mindset or learning mindset. And so those all coupled with the igniter of the Crucible is what I think define the authentic leader. And the academic literature has some different variables on it, but I think this is a nice addition to the academic literature as well as traditional practitioner literature too.
All right. So I'd love to talk about all of them, but since I was just sort of teasing you a little bit about the self-awareness one.
I'll take it. I'll own it.
Well, so let's talk about that one because, I will be teaching a workshop the next 2 days, and I'm confident, and especially now as I'm going to say it out loud, but I'm confident that sometime in the next 2 days, I will say that, self-awareness is a great thing, but most of us aren't very good at it. In fact, research says we're not good at it at all. We got blind spots everywhere. So let's talk about that one as one of the lessons. What are the lessons that you learned or you share in the book? And then how can we encapsulate that and do something with it?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Your prime example, any leadership coach you talk about, executive coach, will tell you that's the hardest thing to get leaders to see, right? Their own self-awareness. So I'm going to tell you the same, probably 5 or 6 things that you would tell anybody else. So if I'm repeating myself, you can just hit mute or some point like that.
No, I'm not going to do that at all.
So I
listen, I need to hear it as much as the next person.
So there are certain things that I think are more impactful than others. So I'll start with what I think is what has the most impact, but is the hardest people to do. And I think that's a basic mindfulness practice, right? I prescribe 1 minute a day for people who really struggle with it. I have ADD, so I have a hard time with mindfulness, but I do see the benefits of it. And the research is pretty clear about the benefits of it as well. So I always say for people who struggle, do a minute a day. There are plenty of websites out there. There's sites called will.com, WHIL.com, that help you along the process. The other thing that I like to do, which I think is also impactful, is journaling exercise, right? It doesn't have to be a manuscript every day. It can be a general question that you have. I'm a huge proponent of the idea that questions shape the reality of what you're trying to create. And so if you can either get help or do some research or use an executive coach like Kevin, he can help you shape the questions that will help you journal what you need to journal. So if you're talking about self-awareness, one question might be at the end of the day might be, think of a moment during the day today where you were most present, right? Just that little question, just bringing you back to a moment in the day where presence was there for you. And that's really important because when you start realizing what those moments were about, what was going on in that moment, it helps you start to recreate those moments as well. But it's that moment of self-awareness and clarity, which is important. And the other thing I tend to ask when I ask these questions are, after you figure out this high point of the day, the other question I ask then is, now what about that gives you an opportunity to be more successful down the road? So now we're attaching the idea of self-awareness and why being self-awareness gives you more opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. So those are a couple exercises. The other one I think is really, really important, that's so hard, is actual feedback. And there's a way that I do feedback. There's 360 feedback. There's 1,000 different ways, but it's the way you frame the feedback that I think is really important. So this is a little tactic that I've learned in the last year and a half that I think is really disarming for people. So what I tend to like to ask people to do is tell me what you love and tell me what you would love to see. Because the love to see is the action item. And the love to see is also not threatening to the person's own ego. And so the love to see becomes a soft way to give you an action item, objective, moving forward. But in that objective, that feedback is giving you self-awareness for a blind spot that you may not know you have. And so when you allow someone to frame it that way, it really, as you, the recipient of that self-awareness, that feedback that I'd love to see, you don't feel as threatened. I mean, I've embedded it in my household so that nobody gets angry when they're getting feedback. And man, it's so powerful. Husband and wife, no fights about it. I'd love to see you do this. Okay, great. I'll do that for you. You know, in an organization, I love to see is like, oh, okay. It's not like, can you do this? Or you should be doing this, or I like it better if you do this. Like those are all kind of hitting someone's ego points. But so those are just a couple of the ideas of self-awareness.
Beautiful. So there are 5, and there's another one that I wanted you to talk about. It's the last one. And as I was thinking about the book, of course, you know, when you read at least me, maybe I'm the only person, James, for whom this is true in the world. But there's sometimes I read a book, I'm like, darn it, I wish I'd have written that one.
Right? Can you say that about my book? Because that would be great.
Yes. But here's the other thing. I was thinking, so why wasn't learning the first of the 5 lessons? Because I'm reading, I'm like, okay, but this is all about learning. Like, so that's another one. So I'm really not asking you, this is not inside the author's studio, everyone. We're not asking, I mean, we've been talking about writing the book, but but I think
that's a great question.
I want you to talk about the learning, the lesson of learning and growth mindset. But I am curious as to why you didn't put it.
Yeah. So as you flip through the book and you get to the last chapter, you'll notice I started writing an equation throughout the whole book.
Yes.
And what you notice at the end is in brackets, there's the infinity sign. And the reason why I did that, and I put learning last, is that without that learning, nothing else actually matters. And it's an infinite process of constantly learning and inspecting and pulling things apart and being curious. And not all of us have, you know, there's this misnomer that, you know, if you have a growth mindset, you have a growth mindset about everything, but that's not how it works. You have a growth mindset about specific things, and other things you have a fixed mindset about. So for example, I have a growth mindset around leadership. I have a fixed mindset around baking, right?
Around what?
So baking. I don't know. I was just pulling an example. I was pulling an example out of my head right now, to be honest with you. I actually love baking. I bake all the time. So that's probably a bad example. I'm trying to think of a good example. I don't know. There's got to be something I have a fixed mindset about. Probably just, I don't know. Anyhow, it's not about this. But the point is,
it's about starting a book. That's what your mindset's about.
I would curse at you right now for insulting me, but we're on a nice podcast.
But I'm smiling. I'm being relatable. I have relatableness right now.
Yeah. So the reason why I put it last is because I wanted to make the point of saying that nothing else really matters without that.
Yeah.
And that is why I put it last. So.
Yeah, and having read almost every page, I sort of knew that, but I wanted you to have the chance to talk about it rather than
thank you
talking. So, but so without, I mean, you've really summarized that point. Without that one, we can't get past the adversity if we're not ready and willing to learn. Say, okay, now what? Next time, right? Yeah. That whole concept. You want to say more about the learning piece?
You can't even. Well, I just think the learning piece is such an interesting part because there's sometimes a mentality of well, like I'm too old, or it's not a problem, or no one's ever told me, whatever. Like, people come up with their own reasons, but coming up with the reasons and excuses of why you cannot is a fixed mindset in itself. Mm-hmm. And so it to me, what I found with the leaders I interviewed is that the ones who said and embraced not only feedback, but curiosity, and embraced the opportunity to learn from the failures that may have happened in their life, which is the adversity moment, right? Which is the going bankrupt, having bankruptcy, death, divorce. I mean, these all different people or leaders had these things happen to them. I found that this was a really interesting thing because they were like, yep, it really sucked. I embraced the suck. I pulled the suck apart. And then I said, okay, is it happening to me or for me? And when they moved from the to me to for me, that's when the learning started to really happen for them as individuals. And it's that shift in mind, that mind shift, which is fundamentally important for any individual, but for a leader specifically, to move on from a bad moment in their leadership journey. Okay, where's the 2 to the 4? So I think that's really important.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop you right there. And everyone who's listening while you're riding your bike or whatever you're doing, you need to stop and you need to think about that question that James just asked, because it's well worth what listening to this podcast is costing you, which is your time, which is the question of, is it happening to me or for me? That's a tremendously valuable question. And if So I had to say it again because I needed you to underline that in your mind because it's such a valuable question. So I really appreciate you sharing the question. And I was ready to say something else when you took a breath, but and then you said that. So I'm glad I kept listening and not just holding on to my moment of what I wanted to say. But you said something else that I think is incredibly valuable too, and it's the connection between curiosity and receiving feedback. Because I believe at some level, if we don't have some level of curiosity about it, if we're not at some level of having a beginner's mind, the feedback we get is going to just get tossed aside, defended away, whatever. And so I don't think people talk about those two ideas together very often. I think it's incredibly valuable. So I appreciate you sharing that as well. I really do.
You know what I think is also really interesting is another aspect of all this learning, you know, and I get this from Dr. Marshall Goldsmith, is the idea of saying, I'm sorry, or apologizing. Because I think there's a tremendous amount of power in those moments, because it's not only creating humility for you, but that's also your opportunity of growth. Because in humility means that you're open to whatever's going to happen next. And so I think that that's another really powerful moment of not only self-awareness, but also compassion for yourself and compassion for the other person as well.
Well, and let's just be honest. You know, I'm going to make an assumption, which is dangerous, I know, that most of the people listening get this at some level already, and it's the people that aren't listening that may need to hear what I'm about to say, because people have sought this out, right? They've sought this out because they're already listening to me, or they wanted to hear you, or whatever. So there's some amount of bias that's in our listeners. But the point that I want to make, and that now I did all that and I lost my point. Literally, I lost my point.
I love the senior citizen moments.
Hey. At least I have hair. Okay. For those of you that are only listening, you don't see that I have gray hair and that James does not.
And there's light glistening off my
really,
dome.
truly lost where I was headed. We were talking about curiosity. Then you said something else
about apology.
About apology. Thank you. So the thing is that so many people. So first of all, everything that you just said about being the humility that comes from being sorry and saying we're sorry and all that stuff is all true. And as a practical matter, many people that work in the world have never had a boss say that to them. Ever. And so if you can say that in authenticity, you just changed the dynamic in terms of how most folks will view you, because they've never had that experience. They'd be shocked in some cases.
You know, and one of the things I like to talk about a lot of times is we confuse being right with doing right. And it's really important sometimes just to do right over be right. You can't control how the other person interprets your words, but you can control the way that you treat them based on their response, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And if you can see what you say hurts them, too often leaders are so afraid to be seen as vulnerable by having to show or apologize that they're fallible, but you are fallible. So that's the short of it. And so sometimes just doing right and recognizing the other person's moment goes so much further to creating a connection with your team and to the individual. And as you know, Kevin, all too well, when you start creating those bonds, not only does it reciprocate, but it also multiplies. And that multiplication effect is actually the ROI that you don't see in the moment, but you see 3, 6, 12 months down the road in revenues, in productivity, in turnover rates, retention, all those things. Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. I'm pretty confident that even though you're in Dubai and I'm in Indianapolis, we could have a long conversation.
Yeah.
Longer than we're going to be able to have. And others might even enjoy listening. Who knows? It's possible. But I do have, before we move on, I have my other last question for you right now is, so is there something that you thought or you wished we would have talked about that we haven't? Something, maybe a question you wished I'd asked now that I haven't asked you?
I really appreciate that question. No one's actually asked me that question. So I don't know where we are in the timestamp of the show. But when this comes out, there will be a companion workbook, a 5-week workbook on how to be more authentic, coming out somewhere within 4 to 6 weeks of this coming out.
Which means it will be out, everybody, when you hear this.
Yeah. Well, what I was taking the December date, so somewhere from December, 4 to 6 weeks after that.
Gotcha.
And I'm working on now with a couple psychologists as well. I like to get psychologists in the mix of these things because I have my own ideas, but I want to make sure the process is a process that holds true to theory as well as practice. I like to make sure whatever I do, I have other experts around me who are specialized in different capacities. So anyhow, I'm working on a 5-week workbook that's an activity a day reflection. It's based on appreciative inquiry. If your audience doesn't know about it, it's a strength-based approach that I think is super impactful for individuals. Yeah, that's the big thing. Yeah. Beautiful.
So we are talking with Dr. James Kelley about his book, The Crucible's Gift, 5 lessons from authentic leaders who thrive in adversity, and coming soon, a companion workbook.
Yes.
All right. So the next section of our show is brought to you by my latest book, The Long Distance Leader, How Do You Lead a Remote Team? And if you got one who's not down the hall, you probably have a remote team. And so the book is called The Long Distance Leader, Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. You can learn more, get a sample chapter, and a whole lot more by going to longdistanceleaderbook.com. Now, sir.
Can I ask you a question about your book?
Sure.
I know it's not really about you, but I'm curious. So in the spirit of curiosity, you know, in this concept, do you find that you're working with more and more leaders that have to manage teams virtually? And if so, how do they do it in a way that keeps everyone motivated and that they feel like the team is doing what they're supposed to do? So the team is being accountable for their actions.
Okay. So there's like a 4-hour question.
Yeah, sorry.
Here's the first part, pretty much everywhere in the world that we're working or we're talking with people and the things that we read are saying is that more and more folks have a remote team. And if you don't now, unless you're working on a shop floor, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're in certain situations. Even we talked to someone recently that moved their whole call center. Everyone's working from home. So even some things you'd thought never would have gone are going. And in some cases, it isn't their whole team, but it's some of the team. And if you get, as I said, if some people have left, then the whole team is now remote. Even if some of them, like I have, hybrid, some down the hall right now, most not. So that's the first thing. The answer is yes. Not everyone's asking us about remote issues, but more and more that's the world. I'm going to be with the group for the next 2 days. The topic is not about remote leadership at all. I'm going to guess, knowing the organization, 2/3 of them will have at least one person who works remotely. The second half of your question, if I can take a really complex question and put it into one short thing that people could do, it would be this. Especially when your people are remote, the clarity that is required for expectations so that people know what you expect and they expect back of you, and not just of the what's. Leaders in general don't do this very well anyway, but if they're down the hall, it's mostly about what do I expect? But when the folks are remote, it's not just the what, but it's the how. How are we going to interact? What tools are we going to get on video, or are we not? Are we going to send emails? Are we going to make phone calls? And 100 of those other kinds of things become critical to creating, giving us the chance to build relatableness, which is one of the lessons we didn't get to today.
Mm-hmm. That's what I was just curious because I feel like that's a complex question. Clearly it's complex, but the idea of trying to create a connection and engagement with a remote force, it becomes more and more complicated without that physicality.
Well, and I would add this, and then we'll move on. Since you've thankfully hijacked my show, I will move on. I will say this last thing, and that is that when people are down the hall, you see them more often, right? And so every individual interaction matters less in a way. When people are remote, there are fewer of them and fewer interactions. So every interaction is a bigger part of the total. So if you think about it from a statistics standpoint, like everyone matters more. And so as important as it is for us to be authentic with our folks down the hall, and it's so many things are heightened when we have to do it at a distance. And so in so many ways, we have to be more intentional when we're at a distance than we had to be when we saw everybody 6 or 7 times a day.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack your show. I was just curious.
But you did anyway. Okay, so hey everybody. Wow, I have got no respect for my guests today, everybody. Listen, I have what we call the fast break, and it's it's 4 words, but it's 3 ideas. I'm just going to share the word and have you just What's your first reaction, thoughts, whatever you want to say about it? No wrong answers. Are you ready?
Yes.
First one is accountability.
A must.
Okay. Number 2, coaching.
It's necessary for development of everybody. Coaching for yourself, coaching for your team, coaching for horizontal, vertical, it's a necessity for growth.
And lastly, change management.
Inevitable. It's going to happen no matter what.
That is for sure. So we've been talking, James, for a good long bit here and chatting and getting to know each other a little bit, and everyone's gotten to know you a little bit. And one of the things that I think is great about your podcast hyphen on hiatus is that you get deeper than just what people do. And so here's my question for you here. What do you do for fun when you're not writing and you're not teaching and you're not doing all this other stuff? What do you do for fun?
I'm scratching my bald head. Probably it's interesting because I pride myself on being a really present dad. So that's a big thing. I'm a huge proponent of living by example. So my wife is a triathlon coach. So this weekend, for example, I did a triathlon on Friday. I did a 5K race on Saturday. And the kids joined us for the triathlon. 2 of them did the triathlon on Friday. All of them did the running race on Saturday. So we tend to be very physically focused. So whether that's fun or not, I'm not sure. It's out of necessity and everyone seems to enjoy it. So I'm part of the process. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you have any kids or not, Kevin. But like, I'm in the midst of just the dirtiness of it. Like you're just going 100 miles an hour and that is fun, but it's exhausting all the time. And it's not the same fun I had when I was 25. And I'm sure it's not the same type of fun I'm going to have when I'm 65. But it is what it is. And so I'm enjoying the process now.
Beautiful. So just everyone, in case you missed that, he does a triathlon for fun. And he just sort of tossed it, on Friday I did a triathlon. That'd be some people's like lifelong moment. And you can put it on Friday, just saying.
Yeah. I have a wife who does it all the time, so I have no choice but to enjoy it.
Or not be married, I suppose. That'd be an option. What's something that you're reading now or that you've read recently that you think people might find of interest?
So for your audience, the book I'm going to name is absolutely a must-read for leaders. And it's called Conversations Worth Having. And it's by Jackie Stavros and Sherry. I'm forgetting Sherry's last name. Sorry, Sherry. But it's about the importance of asking generative, additive questions and how to do it. And it's super, super practical, super, super easy to read. But the takeaways are so important to the world we live in. And, you talked about change management earlier, but we live in this world where change is happening and organizations are living beings, they're living organisms. And if we don't learn how to ask the right questions to shape the right futures, we get the wrong answers. And so it's a really impactful book. So I just recommend that.
Conversations Worth Having. We'll put all the details in the show notes, but you can probably find that. That's all you need to find the book, Conversations Worth Having. So now the question you've been wanting me to most ask you the whole show, which is where can we learn more about you and your work? How can we get your book?
Yeah, so obviously Amazon is the big one. If you're anti-Amazon, I am on the independent bookstores as well, because there are people out there who are anti-Amazon. You can also get the Kindle version, the audio version. It will be out by the time this comes out. So the audio version will come out. You can also go to my website and get a free companion worksheet on relatableness and a free introductory chapter as well. So if you're curious about who I am and what I do. And then for speaking and all that stuff, I'm happy to fly wherever you need me to be, and I will show up and I will be there smiling.
And give us that website.
Yes, and the website is www.drdrjameskelley, Kelley. Again, that's drjameskelley.com.
There you go, everybody. And now a question for all of you who are listening or perhaps watching, and that is, now what? What are you going to do now? Because what's the point if all you do, maybe this might have been among the more entertaining episodes, at least for me, James. But it really doesn't matter. Even if you enjoyed this, I hope you did. If you were entertained, I hope you were. Maybe even you were edified. I hope you were. But nothing really matters unless you take some action. So the question is, what did you get from the last 30, 40 minutes to say, hey, that was something useful to me. Or maybe it was the idea of the connection between curiosity and feedback and how do I use that? Or maybe it was asking this question about, is it happening to me or for me? Or maybe it was any number of the other things that we talked about during the course of our conversation. The challenge to you is not just to take it in, but to take action from it. James, it was a pleasure to have you. It was an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad we got the chance to meet and have this conversation.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate your time, energy, and willingness to have me on your show.
It was my pleasure. So everybody, that's it for this episode. We're back every week, another time, another episode. And if you just found us, there's a whole bunch you can go backwards until I'm back next week. Either way, we'll be here again next week to talk to another leadership expert or expert leader or both right here on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.